Welcome to the Wisdom of Show. I'm your host, Simon Bowen, and every week I'm speaking to the world's greatest leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs about complex issues and impactful leadership. Join us in the Renaissance of Wisdom. Well, welcome back to the Wisdom of, and today we're with Mark Fitzgibbon. He's a reformer who led NIB from a small regional mutual to an ASX 100 powerhouse, and he's worked across government, clubs and healthcare at senior executive roles, and the journey that he's had over the 22 odd years reveals how transformation isn't an event but a discipline. And so in this conversation I want to explore with Mark the mindset, the methods and the meaning behind the sustained leadership success that he's been able to demonstrate. So, Mark, I'm super excited. Thanks for giving this time. I really appreciate it, and I can't wait to see what we unpack together.
Well, it's great to be here, Simon, and I'm very flattered that you thought I was worthy of this discussion.
Well, you have an interesting range of leadership experience, right, in multiple industries, from local government, and so for our international guests, local government would be probably at town level, probably county level in a larger area in our larger local government. So it's that first level of politics inside a community, but also full-on delivery of services with many businesses under the one umbrella. Actually probably makes no sense. You would never start a business like that, lots of challenges, into health and insurance. They're a broad spectrum of industry, so there's plenty to talk about. But let me get straight out of the gate with, the question that probably leaders might want to ask themselves. A lot of the focus on leadership is internally in organizations, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that I know from my own experiences with local governments as a consultant and things like that is that the leaders are leading organizations that by and large, the community, their customers, have almost no understanding of. It's like, I'm just paying to have my rubbish removed. That's not it. There's so much more. And what are the challenges for leaders today in a world where increasingly people don't want to understand your organization and the challenges you're dealing with? They just want the thing done. Mm-hmm. And yet there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of competing agendas. How does a leader start to approach that almost ignorance by choice of the marketplace?
Yeah. How do you give your business salience?
Yeah.
I like to say. But there's also another important question there, Simon. If consumers or constituents don't get what you're doing, maybe you're doing the wrong thing.
That's an interesting perspective.
But yeah. But we'll come back to that point. Look, I think what it does highlight is, and I think there's a risk people pay this lip service for, since they've been at uni, they've been hearing about missions and visions, and after a while, it gets a little bit of cliche. But every organisation exists for a purpose.
Yep.
And being very clear about what that purpose is critical. And being clear about, what vision you have for the organisation around that purpose. You can't be what you can't see. Mm-hmm. And I think, it is a fundamental starting point for leadership to be very clear about your purpose and your vision for the company. It doesn't have to be too lofty. It might be a 5-year vision, could be a 10-year vision. And spend a lot of time articulating that vision. I think John Cotter wrote a piece many years ago now, probably 30 years ago, called Why Transformational Efforts Fail. Mm. And there's quite a few principles that he articulated, but one was spending too little time on communicating the vision. He said, work out what you need to do and then multiply it by 10 and it still won't be enough. Mm. And so, look, I did cross many industries, but for me, common to all those industries was being very clear with your customers or stakeholders, constituents, call them what you will, and your people in the organisation, what problem you're trying to solve for society in the marketplace. And then it follows being very clear about how you plan to go about that.
You referenced, and I think you're right, in many ways, vision and mission have been so overcooked now. It's almost commoditized. It's a throwaway
Yeah.
term, and they're on the walls, but the executive team don't even know what they say, right?
Yeah.
And so, yet absolutely agree with you. You must craft the vision of what the organization is going to do and become. So, what's been your go-to pathway to get to that? Traditionally, a bunch of people get put into a room, facilitator comes in, and let's get the 25-word vision or whatever. But I suspect you're talking about it at a much deeper level than that. So, how do you, as the leader, create and craft that vision?
I just remembered a brief anecdote too, which your listeners might enjoy. So I actually worked in Perth for a company called Steel Mains,
Right.
based in Wembley. And the company at the time, the way they priced their contracts was based upon the standard cost. So it was really important to measure the actual cost versus the standard cost, but not that easy. Like this is back in the early 80s. And as a young upstart, I thought I'd figured out a way to resolve this problem. I remember sitting down the CFO of the time and taking him through this, what I thought was a very elegant solution. And he was very generous. After about 15 minutes, he said, Mark, hold on just a moment. Why are we here? And I said, we're here to, solve this problem. He said, Mark, we're here to make steel pipes. And culturally, everyone at organization knew what the purpose was, to make steel pipes. It doesn't have to be this missive about, the company and the world and what's trying to do. Often the best mission and vision statements are the simplest.
Mm.
So anyway, to your point, yeah, look, I've been through many forms of developing this thinking. As you say, often they start with, workshops where you think through what's the mission, vision, what are the strategies, what are the goals, how's that map to our financial objectives, etc. And that's all still important. You do a SWOT analysis or whatever form of scanning. What the big turning point in my thinking around this, and particularly strategy, occurred a few years ago when I started to dive into this idea of determinism, this idea that in the total scheme of things, most of the things that will decide our success or failure are actually pretty much out of our control. They're huge external factors around technology, whatever the case may be. The British East India Company dominated the world for 400 years. It's probably the world's greatest company ever. It collapsed in the late 19th century, not because of its strategy or its competencies within the business, but the world changed. The world turned against colonization. The world turned against slavery, and it didn't capture those thematics. It didn't adapt to that world. So my starting point for helping, or wherever I've been working, or in the past and today's, it's kind of a bit of a SWOT back to front. Let's talk about the external thematics, which are going to impact our business. Let's think about, how big the opportunities might be, because there's no use going after thematics which really don't offer much opportunity in terms of the size of the opportunity. And let's think about how we might better understand and comprehend those issues, better prepare for those thematics, so that we're able to adapt and prosper in that world. It's a very much a biological view of the world. Like in biology, we know the species that do well are those who adapt.
Yes.
All polar bears are white, not because somehow in their brains they worked out if they turned white, they would be more successful in hunting in the Arctic regions. Just once upon a time, some white bears were born and they did better than the black and brown bears. So this idea of really understanding what's going in your marketplace or constituency or even the world, depending upon the size of your company, and what that means for your company and how you might best adapt to those circumstances is the way I approach, strategy today. And look, I was very successful at NIB, that strategy. By definitions, I don't want to overdo the biological analogy, but by definition, it means you need to experiment. You need to debate and be quite adept at amplifying those mutations that work well and are proving successful, and every bit as discipline in cutting off those mutations, those experiments. And of course, they're not experiments if you know the result. So by definition, if you're going to try something new, you've got to think about it as, an experiment.
Yeah. There's a book title there, the biological approach to strategic thinking.
Yeah.
But you reformed the clubs sector in New South Wales. You led three large, local governments or municipalities. NIB, came from a mutual health fund to Australia's fourth largest health insurer. These are big transformations, and so your leadership track record isn't really about just leading organizations, it's transforming them. And you have this kind of progressive and entrepreneurial approach with a challenging business models sort of approach. And I suspect as you get below strategy, you start to challenge the models that are existing. Can you walk me through some of that thinking?
Oh, look, the advantages I had in all of those cases, all of those CEO roles I've had, is that I came in at a time where the governing body was looking for dramatic change. The companies were failing. All of the councils I led were, rightly or wrongly, the governing body decided that they needed a fresh approach. It was the same at clubs. It was the same at NIB. So I had that advantage. What was that? What's the old line? Lord, give me a low bottom line to start with, as a CEO. So I certainly had that advantage. The governing bodies had the appetite for change. It wasn't always as much as it turned out to be, but I had that license, and I had that important honeymoon period where you go in, and it sounds a little bit ruthless, but for example, it was my consistent methodology that I'd replace the senior management team. At the end of the day, as we've discussed previously, Simon, you are the maestro, the orchestrator. You need the talent around you to succeed. So that's been a common theme for me. Personally, I've always been, I guess, a critical thinker. I question everything. What is the basis for this particular approach to the business? I'm not afraid to ask the dumb questions. I try and create an environment which is psychologically safe for everyone to start asking the dumb questions, including maybe people who've been in the business down the ranks who've always had a view, but never felt comfortable with expressing that view because of the culture of the business. So, I've been inclusive in that sense in seeking out views of, right across the organisation. I've always given license to people to experiment, which goes back to our discussion about biology. Unless people feel as though they can take risk and experiment without fear of punishment or retribution, you're just not going to get that entrepreneurship, that culture of entrepreneurship across the company. And I guess, and it sounds a bit cheesy, but I've always tried to ensure an even temper and good humor. Like if you, the businesses I run has no tolerance for shouting, pushing, bullying people, of course, but even things that 30 years ago we would have considered nothing. I've long tried to ensure that the organisation has a sense of humour and harmony, and nobody got too excited about themselves.
It's an interesting commentary around leadership. I have a lot of conversations about leadership with a lot of clients and podcast guests and others, and I do have a view that leadership is one role where there's no room for emotional instability. The organization leans on your emotional stability. It doesn't mean you don't express dissatisfaction with an outcome or whatever, but it's actually how you go about doing it. And is there a reason in a workplace really for outright anger and attack? I don't think there is.
No, there's none. Look, there's There are times where you may have to get aggressive, so long as it's conscious and
Yeah.
not just your emotion trying to control. There's this whole theory of transaction analysis where our behaviors are either aggressive,
Mm.
assertive, or passive. And at all times, we should try to be assertive. But there are times where we need to get aggressive to meet aggression so that we can deal with the person
Mm.
assertively. So there's no point trying to reason with somebody who's trying to punch you in the face.
Mm.
Equally, there's times where we may have to be passive, lie down the floor, metaphorically, or somebody to deal with them and bring them up to a level where. So, absolutely, there is no place for any form of belligerence and anger and aggression. The only exception to that, and it should hopefully it's rare, is in order to deal with somebody. Well, what did Churchill say in that wonderful movie, the Darkest Hour, when they're suggesting that he make peace through Mussolini with Hitler? So this is in
Mm.
1939, and Britain's being pummeled, as you know. He said, "You can't reason with a tiger when they have your head in its mouth."
Yeah.
So, what I heard another good one recently. Um, you can't reason somebody out of a situation they didn't reason themselves into.
Yeah.
So, I've found over my career, sometimes you need to get a little bit bolshy
Yeah.
in order to do it. I had a couple of examples, for example, with unions, where they're getting really bolshy and, really trying to knock me over.
Yeah.
Again, metaphorically. But yes, no. I'm a huge fan of Ted Lasso. If you've watched Ted Lasso, it's one of the awesome um, um, programs and lessons in leadership. And Ted is calm, measured. He's not perfect. He knows his vulnerabilities, but he maintains that sense of good humor and egalitarianism across the business.
Yeah. There's a kind of a two-axis model that I often talk about where the outcome is the vertical and relationships are the horizontal, right?
Yeah,
And so if the outcomes matter more than the relationships, be willing to go to battle if you need to, right?
yeah,
But if the relationships matter, and there's not that many circumstances in a business setting where the outcomes trump the relationships,
yeah.
but if the relationships matter more than the specific outcome at the time, you might have to give some ground to maintain the relationships in order to get the lines to meet in the middle. And I think that tension between outcome and relationships is a conscious decision leaders need to be making. You know,
Absolutely. And of course, it depends how you define relationships. So, for example, all the senior executives that I've led over the years, and there's been, quite a few, we've had good relationships in return, and with mutual respect for each other, but we're never best friends.
no,
And that simply is being pragmatic. That simply recognizes that there may be times where I have to, put my foot down and act with some level of authority, or maybe even remove you from your current result. Just like there may be times where the board felt they might have to remove me in certain circumstances. So, I define relationships as mutual respect and for each other rather than something more personal.
sure. So, when uh, you transformed NIB, you really had to tackle governance structures and, um, you know, um, just the demutualization of it and things like that. So these are big changes.
Mm.
How, as a leader, and you obviously came in when they wanted the changes. Sometimes people take over a role and there's not that size of an agenda, but how do you maintain um, fundamental ongoing performance so the customer or the client isn't being affected by this major change at organizational level? Because they can often be in conflict with each other trying to
Yeah,
drive this change.
no, 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 absolutely. And particularly if you're making changes, you may well be displacing people.
Mm.
Um, if you just take NIB as an example, although I could use others, I don't brag about this and I'm not proud of this, but we lost a lot of people at NIB as part of the changes that we made. But while there were job losses, NIB in my tenure went from employing less than 400 people to 2,000 people. So it's not as though we weren't creating opportunities for people. But getting back to your question, look, again, it starts with a vision for the governing body to support the kind of transformational changes you have in mind. You've got to be clear about what you're trying to create and articulate that. And that hopefully gets them excited. You need to be clear about, the risks associated with that, such as, disrupting the workforce, through retrenchments and changes in the shape of that workforce. You need to be pragmatic. I'll give you an example about pragmatic. When I started NIB, they'd already brought in a consultant to review the business, and the consultant recommended that the company close all of its 80 shops, its branches, scattered mainly throughout the Hunter Valley. Now, that was a very sensible decision from an economic, financial point of view. But there's no way in the world, as aggressive as I was planning to be with transformation, I wasn't going to shut those shops anytime soon. That was just going to bring too much heat onto the organisation in a way that you're describing. And I guess when I think about it, I don't recall any change we made where it ran the risk of compromising the customer experience. Our efforts were very much about growth. And I guess it comes back to the point too. It's one thing to talk about a vision, but you need to back it up with some science and logic and determinism, understanding of what's happening. I'll give an example, NIB. So what changed there? Very early on in my tenure, we calculated that the lifetime value of a customer, a policyholder, was infinitely greater than the cost of acquisition. And we checked our numbers time and time again. We thought, well, hey, why isn't the industry investing more? And it wasn't investing more in acquisition because it had gone to sleep. It had been rescued by the Howard government with the rebate and other policy changes. So we thought, okay, well, this is a very strong case for investment in growth. The other thing we worked out is where were the gaps in the market? So back then, about half of Australians had health insurance, but under 40s, only in that segment, only about 30% of people had health insurance. And, because younger people think they're bulletproof, they had Medicare in any case. But we thought if we could tap this marketplace, we could do well, and we did. And so we designed products which are more attractive to younger people. So, for example, we allowed younger people to carve out cover that they didn't need, like obstetrics or replacement knees and hips. Now, at the time, we were accused of selling fake health insurance, and we said, well, no, we're just giving younger people choice. They can rely on Medicare for these other risks associated with their health. And we started to invest in digital marketing. We positioned the brand in that youth space. We sponsored Geelong Cats and Newcastle Knights. We even sponsored the sports stadium in Perth way back in the mid-noughties. So we had a very clear view about how we were going to grow the business, and it worked. After a while, it became very clear we'd been so successful in positioning our brand in that youth space. We thought, well, that market is pretty full now. How can we go after the older segments of the marketplace without compromising our brand as a youth-orientated brand? And we did that through partnerships with Suncorp, Qantas. So if you buy Qantas health insurance, you're really buying NIB's health insurance. It's just labelled by us, and Qantas labelled it. We use the aggregators. So it wasn't just a matter of convincing the board, the governing body of the board, as it were. And this was the same when we listed the business, because that was all about attracting, being able to raise capital to support this organic growth and hopefully some M&A. It was about having a very clear path, an economic case, to pursue that particular vision.
Yeah. And so when you talk about, most CEOs come to the role through a corporate ladder. They've been the CFO or the COO. They've either been in product or design, and then they become the CEO of the company. you came through local government, you came through grassroots politics, you came through community, actually, in many, many ways. And I'm very interested in the idea of, business also being a force for good at a community and a world level. How do you think, what's different about your perspectives that to most CEOs, based on that experience you've had where you're up close and personal with the community who have the right to make judgments basically through elections and things like that, and you're dealing with multiple trades and disciplines and industries and union groups. It's a rich experience a lot of CEOs don't have. What are the perspectives you gained out of that if you're talking to a young CEO today, you'd be trying to say, just there's some stuff worth knowing? What would you share with them?
Yeah. Well, look, I fell into local government. I grew up in a country town and went to work for the biggest corporation in town, which happened to be the local council. And I'd actually started a economics degree at Newcastle Uni and a job as a trainee with a large plumbing company called Watson and Crane. But that got all too hard. And so I fell into a council job. It allowed me to go to footy training in the afternoons without the travel. I could study externally, spend more time with my girlfriend. So all these important issues came into play in putting me in the local government. But as you say, it was rich in complexity in as much as it was very diverse. An industry, you have librarians, parks and gardens people who build roads, town planners, engineers, health and building surveyors. And with that diversity comes complexity, and challenges. And I think, I did learn to, work through all of those challenges, the different unions that were involved, the different kingdoms. You could do a case study of local government in terms of who has controlled the councils since World War II, the engineers and the health and building surveyors and the town planners and et cetera, et cetera. So it was a good nursery for learning, my management skills, and there was plenty of thematics I could grab onto. So, I really made my mark in local government as a young executive, with contestability, this idea that just because council had an obligation to ensure the community received certain services, it didn't actually have to deliver those services itself. It could go to a specialist like Cleanaway to pick up the rubbish rather than, use a day labour. So that was just one example of my early attraction with, how could we do things differently? How's the world changing in a way which we can exploit by being better and faster than anyone else at adapting to that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, we think at an entrepreneurial level, we think we have to create everything about our solution. But you bring value to the market either by creating it or curating it. And we feel like we have greater control over creating it ourselves. But that really comes down to the quality of the relationship. If you have someone that you curate to provide a part of the solution, they're both equally valuable. And in some respects, it's better to have someone else doing it if they're better than you at that particular piece. But it's if you think about that, the complexity of running those kinds of organizations. And you said you can almost, it was interesting when you said, you can almost map the kingdoms that have led local government. That's probably true for organizations too.
Absolutely.
When were the operational people in charge? When were the sales people in charge? When were the finance people in charge? And you could probably map an organizational history against those kingdoms as well. I'd never thought about that.
Yeah, no, I call them fiefdom. And there's look, I'm just fresh back from France where I did a university course which studies what they call psychodynamics.
Yes.
Which is an organizational form of psychoanalysis. So the psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud and others is really trying to, Freud would say you could think of our thinking as an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg which you see above the sea is our conscious thinking. At the bottom of it's all this unconscious stuff, these fears, emotions, predilections, desires, which aren't conscious. To Freud, most of them, are developed in our childhood. And so in psychoanalysis, what the therapist tries to do is uncover some of these issues deep in our subconscious, because you can't deal with them until you uncover them and understand what they are. So psychodynamics is taking that same concept to an organization. So, what are people really talking about down the pub with the boys or girls that they're not saying to their leaders? What are those water cooler discussions? What are the things that maybe happened 10 or 15 years ago that are still impacting the organization and how it views the world and opportunities and threats? Um, you know, as leaders, we need to somehow, and it comes back to what we discussed earlier about having relationships, a culture of egalitarianism without, wanting to overstate that, and trust and psychological safety. So we begin to have some of these honest discussions with our people to better understand what some of the blockers may be, or what some of the opportunities may be, which have been buried because people have suggested it in the past and they've been kicked in the backside because of it.
And you've spoken several times about the people dimension and the need to provide psychological safety, and really you're talking about solid leadership and building great team, great culture, etc., etc. And one of the greatest challenges, people might argue, certainly in the workplace, but maybe for humankind, and I've had other podcast guests that have really gone into this at deep levels, is of course the emergence of AI. It's very possibly bigger than the Industrial Revolution. It may well be bigger than the internet. I don't know, because I can't predict the future. It is displacing people. It's probably destroying some psychological safety for some people in the workplace. I don't want to talk about it from the perspective of teams. I'd love to explore it from the perspective of leadership, because you spend so much time in the transformation space. This is going to be an emerging thing for anyone that does transformation type work. Like, what are we going to do with AI? How are we going to use it? But people buy from people. Organizations are people. Communities are people. How do we hold our focus on people while we do that? I don't know if you've had, if you've, you're about 10 months out of NIB, it definitely hit by then. It was November 2022 that it really burst onto the scenes for people with chat. I'm just wondering what your thought processes are about people, and particularly leadership of people, in this AI-driven world that we're in.
Well, I agree with you, Simon, and in the sense that I think this will be bigger than the Industrial Revolution, which is a big call. So it is as deterministic a factor as, I mentioned, my thinking around determinism, that, really our success or failure just depends upon our ability to adapt. So I think this will be as deterministic a factor than any ever before. I've sat in certain sessions where people, as though they had crystal balls, are making all these predictions about this and that. And there's part of me, I shake my head and think, well, look, you haven't got a crystal ball. Who knows where this is going? I guess the starting point for me is I believe in humanity, which sounds a bit, okay, that sounds a bit wishy-washy, I know, but I do. And what's that great line out of Desiderata? Whether or not it's clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should. I really believe that. So you've got to be a little bit stoic about it and think, well, look, this is the way the world's going. How are we going to cope with that? And so, my counsel, if I can call it that, to people is, look, this is coming. You've just got to do your best with your people to understand it and comprehend, what it is, what guardrails might need to be erected ethically and otherwise. What your tolerance is likely to be for retrenchments, or whatever the case may be. So understanding and comprehending, and really thinking hard about, across the broad spectrum of possible scenarios, how you're going to adapt your organization, how you're going to be agile. You're not going to be able to predict what life looks like in 30 years' time and bet the company on that particular outcome. You're just going to have to be, we've been talking about agility for decades now, but this is going to require adaptability and agility. And hopefully, like most of the technological changes we've seen in the past, well, since the cart and wheel, I suppose. Hopefully it is, Homo sapiens are clever enough to harness it for good.
Well, we are the greatest risk with AI, actually.
Mm.
And, you can't predict what will be in 30 years' time. At the moment, we might not be able to predict what will be in 5 years' time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in reality, as much as our egos don't like to admit it, we can't actually what will be in 5 months' time, because anything could happen, and that has nothing to do with AI, the state of the world or whatever. So you do have to lead to the future, but you also have to lead in the now, in the present. And that brings me to this other kind of conversation where you
Can I just say in that
yeah.
point, like one of we had 10 value statements at NIB. Status quo is death was one of them. Without taking risks, we cannot grow is another one. One of them was smart is cool. And something I have tried to do over the years is make scholarly type pursuits kind of cool.
Mm.
Like sadly, when I started at Cessnock Council back in those days and went to uni, a lot of the older guys scoffed at me. They kind of suggested, "Oh, what do you think you're better than everyone else or something?" Of course, I didn't. I was just interested in pursuing an education. So, I think we can't do enough to encourage people coming through the ranks to stay curious, have a growth mindset, and a sense of lifetime learning. If you don't, I really think they're important to the success of individuals and, of course, the organisations
Yeah.
um, they lead.
So when you're setting a vision for an organization, do you always want to get outside of the organization as well to feed that vision
Absolutely.
with insight?
Yeah, absolutely, I do, because you can't prosper in a deterministic world unless you're really understanding what is happening out in that world, where the trends, what are the developments in other industries. Yeah, I've always thought about if I look at a development in any industry, I've always thinking about what possible application this may have to our industry.
Yeah.
Part of our thinking around going after younger people at NIB was Qantas and Jetstar. Like if we actually called a project Nibstar, we were going to be like Jetstar. Was like we had no Qantas, although maybe I remember thinking at the time maybe somebody comes along and maybe a Qantas in health insurance comes along and buys us like a big American company or whatever the case may be. And I was okay with that because if that was good for shareholders and our policyholders in the end. But yeah, no, I'm very, very externally focused, but with my mind set on, well, what implications does this have for our businesses today and tomorrow?
Sure. And NIB consistently outgrew industry averages, right? Now that by itself as a statement means there's obviously measures that let you know that. There's some key metrics that you're looking at all the time so that you know that you're tracking, you've set a vision, you've laid out a strategy. Now you've got to measure progress. And there's a lot of focus on goal setting. There's not enough focus on tracking progress. And, how do you think through measures at the organizational level? I mean, is there a methodology that you've applied? Did you turn to tools like the balanced scorecard, or did you have your own set of metrics that you consistently put in place? You would usually rehire the executive team. You must then set an agenda for them and say, this is how I know what the end looks like. This is what's important to me. That conductor kind of has a sound of
Yeah.
what things going to sound like. How do you think your way through key measures and metrics?
Well, like most companies, we have our KPIs. It's as a public company, it's relatively easy to keep focused on measures because you have a share price in the marketplace each day. Now, a share price can be misleading. It doesn't necessarily reflect intrinsic value, but in the long run, they tend to be, on the money. So probably the best way to answer that as a CEO, the board sets certain measures for me, which are totally aligned with the measures for the company, from revenue growth to profitability, to equity and diversity, the other ESG factors we spend a lot of time on thinking about today. And then I cascade those down across my executive team. So yeah, the measures are fairly transparent in a company like NIB, because then those measures are published in the annual report for shareholders and anyone else.
So take a founder who's established a pretty great business that looks like it's growing quite rapidly, right? They don't have a board. They don't have to publish their results. It's entirely owned by the founder, but now they employ people. They got a bunch of people working for them whose livelihood depends upon the success of the company. They got a bunch of customers who are depending on the company. They've actually put a peg in the sand in the community. I'm like you, I'm from small country towns. Like, the local businesses were the pillars of the community. And picture that you're counseling this founder entrepreneur, and you want, what, do they put the focus on predominantly profitability? They put it on, what's the market capitalization of the company? Where would you point someone who doesn't have that corporate experience that you have?
Well, if I was giving advice to somebody tomorrow, I'd say one measure is definitely revenue. Now, a lot can go wrong underneath the revenue line, we all know, but you don't shrink yourself to greatness. If you're going to become greater, you need to focus on that top line. They need to focus in on the bottom line. This all sounds a little bit simplistic, but it is fairly simple. So, that focus on the bottom line it's likely to put you in a position where you can not only become wealthier, but attract capital. And maybe the earnings you retain, or the fact that you're so successful that you can go public. And of course, in between that top line and that bottom line, there's a range of factors associated with operating expenses, the capitalization in the business, your debt servicing, for example. You should have some customer metric. Traditionally we've used NPS. Maybe AI is one of those areas which allows us to be much more precise and sophisticated about measuring customer sentiment. The whole ESG, and look, I'm not a fan of the administration in the US today, but there has been overreach with ESG. And as important as it is within an organizational context, of course, it's important to have equal opportunity and diversity and inclusion. Of course, it's important to, be playing our bit in protecting the globe and mitigating carbon emissions and global warming. But I have a sense, and of course, it's important that our employees feel engaged, safe, and happy. But I have a sense, and so you can give some weight to those measures, but I have a sense that if you're not doing those things well, it's going to hit your top line and bottom line. Maybe not next year or the year after, but eventually it will. So I've been saying this for years. I think we'll stop talking about diversity and inclusion in years to come, because it's just taken for granted. Hopefully it's taken for granted. Hopefully people just accept, of course, there should be as much opportunity for somebody, a person of color, as a white guy or gal.
Yeah. So if we, because there are all these nuances all the way through a business, but if we then try to simplify this down for people, if the growth of the business is shown by top line growth,
yeah,
I have to ask the question, and you grew NIB, so where do you most aggressively point your attention as the primary leader of the business to try and drive top line growth?
Well, so I go back, and I should have included in that analysis, return on invested capital, because ultimately, what's that old saying? Markets innovate, not companies.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the capital will follow returns in invested capital, and that invested capital will, and they'll of course be influenced by consumer behaviour and all the kind of thematics we've discussed. So I touched upon this earlier when we did the analysis at at NIB, we call it pollen on the bum. We used to find the insight that bees go out in the field every day and they come back from their reconnaissance at the end of the day into the hive and they do a little dance in front of the cheap bees, and those bees which have the most nectar or pollen coming off their backsides, they signal to the cheap bees, that's the guy we follow tomorrow. So
Mm.
we we quaintly call it pollen on the bum. So at NIB, when we looked at an investment opportunity, our first question, well, how much pollen on the bum does this have? In other words, what's the size of the opportunity and what's the likely return on the capital? Because if we're going to invest, a dollar, which costs us 10%, that's our weighted average cost of capital, we need to be pretty confident that it's going to return maybe 15 and 16 cents in the dollar on, a risk adjusted basis. So, the first point is, where is the opportunity in the marketplace based upon our thematics and our deterministic worldview? Within that space, if you like, where are the investments that make the most sense? And so I mentioned we decided that under 40s market was the area that was going to make the most sense for us. The fish were harder to catch, but there were lots of them. And then there's a whole question of, if we're successful, what do we do with the bounty of that success? One of my criticisms of mutualization, and look, I ran councils and the club industry is a huge mutual industry. NIB was a mutual for 5 years while I was there. I've got nothing philosophically against mutuality. My big bugbear of mutuality is they can't distribute the capital back to shareholders for it to be redeployed in other productive pursuits. All a mutual can do is retain the capital. And so they're very inefficient as managers of capital. A lot of the mutuals say, oh, no, we give it back in the form of lower prices. Well, not in health insurance, you don't. Because if you did, NIB wouldn't be competitive. Medibank Private wouldn't be competitive. And they have this curious system called risk equalisation, which pretty much equalises prices, premiums across the sector. So, what managing that capital in many ways is one of our most important responsibilities of leaders of companies, whether they be private or public.
Yeah, and I think that I think about my own executive experience in a senior role with CSR a long time ago. We capital ruled our conversation. And anytime we want to do anything, we need to be able to argue the return on that capex. And but it's not a conversation that's often in the entrepreneurial space. It's just like we're going to spend that, we're going to buy that, and maybe it's an art in the startup and the founder kind of business market that is interesting. If you think about your years in multiple organizations and in leadership roles, I want to start to wrap this up with what's the real wisdom you would share. You have daughters who are in business, and I've got a daughter on the podcast here with me who's in our business, and I often think about if I got to pass one thing on, and I said to them, this is like a rule I'm actually giving you now. Don't compromise this, and this is based on wisdom. This is hard earned. It's 30 years in the making. Don't break this rule. What or a young business leader you're working with, and I know this is without notice, but what would you be wanting to share with them so that you felt pretty confident about the leaders that are coming through?
So you're asking me what the single answer is to sustainable business success, which I say 64.
Yeah, just give a number, right?
Yeah. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah.
Look, it's a good question, and I get asked this a lot. But when I'm asked, I typically say, "Well, let's sit down and have a coffee," because you run the risk of just sounding trite. But look, pushing it. I think we're probably covered in our discussion. Being very clear about what you're trying to achieve, what problem you're trying to solve for people or society. Be very clear about how you're going to go about that. Like, you can't be the big ideas person who hasn't really done their homework and given thought to how it might actually be done. I've seen startups with big ideas, particularly in this digital world, but when you look under the bonnet and say, well, look, what is the logic behind this? How doable is this? Very often they're lacking. Many call it field chosen, and the ones that are chosen tend to be um, the guys and girls who've done their homework.
Mm.
I'd ask them to be very clear upon how you monetize this opportunity, because not out of avarice, but because you don't have a sustainable business unless it's making, generating earnings and through that being able to attract capital for growth and development. I'd suggest that they need to think about their role as a maestro, particularly founders. I've just joined a wonderful company called GemLife that IPO'd in July. It's been created by it's a founder-led business, and he's has a terrific sense about the business because he's been in it for so long, how it operates, how it can generate earnings. He's now a public company, which he's having to get used to, but he's doing that with aplomb. There's not much we can tell Adrian Polich about how to run his business, but as Neds, we're there to, I suppose, provide a level of mentorship, and just help him, adapt to this new world of being a public company. So look, that's a bit long-winded. I know you're looking for a
Well,
short
maybe
answer, and I might tell them to watch Ted Lasso because it's one of the great tutorials.
well, maybe the rule is don't look for the single answer. Look for the right people.
Absolutely, but it starts with the leader.
Yeah.
You do have to have the right people around you, the right people on the bus, to quote Jim Collins. But leaders. The other thing, I guess, occurs to me too. It kind of reflects. I've never been worried about taking on a role that is a little bit left field, like the club's
Yeah.
job. My first thought, Paul Keating once said, the future belongs to the enlargers. Whenever I take on a new role, maybe it's something wrong with me psychologically. I'm thinking about what can we do with this?
Yeah.
It's the same at NIB. So think big without being, hubristic about it.
Yeah.
And, certainly my daughters, who, as I mentioned earlier, have a digital business, I'm always encouraging them to think big. Don't be cautious and be well researched in the investment you make. But, the status quo is death.
Yeah. Yeah. What
We,
can we
we
do?
have we have to be thinking about something larger, something greater,
Yeah.
uh, to drive our own sense of motivation and the motivation by others to maybe tip, capital into our
Yeah.
business.
And what can we do with this? And does it have pollen on the bum?
Yes. Yeah.
It's just I'd love to wrap up with just kind of two or three quick questions, quick responses, if that's okay.
Sure.
What's a recent book that you've read and loved, in terms of insights gained out of it?
Most recent book I've read is Let Them, by I have
Mel Robbins.
Mel Robbins. Yeah, but it really is just it's Stoicism.
Right.
Yeah, in a modern form. So the philosophy of Stoicism is that a bit like I've been talking about with the term determinism. The Stoics would say the source of all our misery is unfulfilled expectations. And as Mel says in her book, Let Them, there's so many things that occur around us that happen to us, which we have really no control over. All we can control is how we respond to those
Mm.
circumstances. So if I want to play golf tomorrow and it pours rain, I can't play. I can get all upset about that, but I have no control over the weather. All I can control is my reaction. And in
Mm.
that case, it should be okay. Well, I don't know, we'll go to the movies for the day.
Yeah.
So it's an important book that she's written, even if it's just borrowing, pretty much out of Seneca's and Marcus Aurelius's,
Mm.
lessons of
Absolutely.
stoicism. Mm.
Is there a personal philosophy that you always find yourself turning back to in business and life? Is there something you hear yourself saying? You may well have already shared it with us over the course of the episode, but is there a specific personal philosophy that you turn to regularly?
Well, and it has elements of stoicism, I suppose. Look, I watched a movie on dinosaurs coming home in a plane from France recently. That they 60 million years ago, and they dominated the planet for millions of years. We're here for a microsecond,
Mm,
not even that. You and me.
mm.
So make the most of it. That requires a little bit of stoicism, but it also just requires, as we discussed earlier, having a positive view about humanity and our place in it. You know, enjoying life, enjoying our achievements, accepting our failures and our vulnerabilities from time to time, and never, taking ourselves too seriously.
Yeah. What's a moment of real joy and pride that sticks out for you professionally over the years? Something you're really very proud of that you drove?
Before you said business, I was going to say, my kids, because nothing compares to that.
That's
Uh,
right. That's why I had to say business, because when I've just in an open loop, everyone says their children's.
yeah, but grandkids are just as good, and you
Right.
can give it back. Look, it'd have to be NIB and what we're able to achieve there. So, when I hit the finishing line, I think we listed the business at 300 million, and it was almost $4 billion by the time we left. Had an international operations. So it'd be hard to go past that. And I think the fact that even here with you today, that people see value, that I still have some value to add in terms of my lived experience and, other
Mm.
work I've done. That's very gratifying as well.
Yeah, we can never allow ourselves to stop valuing wisdom that can only be gained through experience.
Mm.
There's a certain amount that learning and education can do, but wisdom comes from the experience, and we should never stop recognizing the power of
Yeah,
that.
yeah, and that experience may support the theory that we've learned. It may be ambivalent, and sometimes it will contradict it.
Yeah.
And I get really excited when I read some theory which contradicts my lived experience. I like to understand, well, what's going on there? Is it the massive generalization of the theory that's wrong versus my deep kind of more qualitative
Yeah.
experience, or have I just misinterpreted
Yeah.
experience?
Good. Well, Mark, thank you so much for giving us this time so generously today. I appreciate it, and sharing, so openly across all these years of leadership, and you know, um, commercial leadership, but also community leadership in the roles that you've had. And I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to people being able to watch the episode.
Okay. Well, look, thanks again.
Thank you.